Thank you so much. That was way too kind introduction. I come from Bergen, so of course we want people to come to Bergen. This is a small place up in the north. So we love to have company, but it has also been a true inspiration for us to have all the people coming up and interacting with young people on the topic that is very dear to us, namely the issue of fairness and moral motivation. So very happy to be here today. Had a wonderful start and chat with Urs and then with Christina and Patrick. I don't know whether they are here. Learn about their research. Thrilled to be here and present for you. So I will talk about the business of mistakes, the moral acceptability of consumer exploitation. So this is a bit more than a paper. I mean, hopefully it will be a paper. It's now a slide deck, but hopefully we'll write out the paper. But it's more than a paper because it's in some sense what I want to work on for the next 5 to 10 years. So it's really like something that is close to my heart. I worked a lot on fairness in thinking about fairness in redistribution and inequality, but I think this topic speaks to me, so I hope to do much more. And that means that I also would love to have any kind of feedback. I mean, this is a first touch. I mean, you will see it's a little bit high level. A lot of this is descriptive, but it got me going, and I would love to do more. So any comments you have on specifically what I present, would love to hear it, and also like more generally where you think we can go with this kind of stuff. It's joint work with Alexander, my co-author. We just decided at some point that, I mean, we just do everything together, so that's very easy. And then it's with Jonas Tungodden, and now you may think, well, is Tungodden a very common name in Norway? And it's not. So this is my son, so that also, of course, makes it a bit special. So it's the first paper I have with him. Having said that, I've written papers with Alexander's brother and Alexander's wife. So it is a lot about family in Norway. And just as a warning, we are working on a paper that will be Kappelen, Tungodden. So just how it is. Bergen is not a big place. Okay, so I also have a lot of slides. So you said there were many slides. I don't need to cover all the slides. I will give you the big picture stuff in the beginning, and then we see how many slides we cover. I just want you to interrupt whenever you have things on mind. Okay, so what got me going on this was, in some sense, I mean, all the stuff you read about how businesses, in some sense, and words are important here, but I call it, are exploiting consumers, right? So you read about the papers showing that, I mean, banks will go after poor people, get them to take these credit cards. They shouldn't have taken them. It brings them into deeper debt. It brings them into trouble. You know how hard it is to cancel subscriptions. You know about the hidden fees. I mean, so businesses are into all these kind of things where they try to manipulate consumers. And I was thinking, like, this is in some sense maybe the way the world is, but is that how we should think about it? And we are not the first to claim this. So, I mean, there's this very famous book by Akerlof and Schiller called Fishing for Fools, which basically makes the same point, right? They say, I mean, so markets, in some sense, markets, the way we think about markets as economists is like, good for me, good for you. We have this kind of voluntary transaction, we both agree on it, and the only reason we agree on it is that it's good for both of us, and that should probably be fine, right? And that's like 101 of economics. But what they say is, well, but actually, markets also produce good for me, bad for use. And how should we think about that? And how do they do it? Well, they do it through what they say exploitation, through manipulation and deception. And what they say is that in some sense this is an intrinsic feature of markets, because it will happen as long as, I mean, it's possible to make profit out of it. And that, of course, raises the question, well, it's an intrinsic feature of a free market. To what extent should we protect consumers by regulation? Of course, that's a big topic. I mean, this is like one of the big topics these days with AI and everything happening. So it's not new, but I mean, it's not something we really have studied carefully in terms of how people think about these things. Another thing that got me going was really the fantastic literature in behavioral IO that have looked at this idea of how consumer mistakes are exploited in markets. So basically the history of behavioral economics was like we learned that people are not perfect, they're not rational always, they're sometimes irrational. And then came the nudging literature saying we have to help, we have to come up with choice architecture. But then came the literature saying, well, businesses are probably taking advantage of this, right? And they are doing big time. And there are papers showing, I mean, how limited attention, so these are often theory papers, how limited attention is exploited through hidden fees or complex pricing. And for example, in credit cards, I mean, the argument saying that this is basically a big redistribution from the poor to the rich, or from the lowest to the highest, whatever way you want to call it. Because many of these credit cards, I mean, they are profitable because there are a lot of people making mistakes and paying all these fees and so on. Those who can handle this, for them it's good that these credit cards exist, but they only exist because, I mean, some people are exploited. That's what makes the profit. You have the time inconsistency and self-control problems, I mean, where we exploit short-term focus. I mean, payday loans is one thing, gym membership can be another. We have the use of default effects, where people just basically stay with the default. So you have auto-renewals, pre-ticket insurance, and you have the left-digit bias stuff that has been studied recently in tech companies, where you use psychological pricing and focus, I mean, to have it just below, I mean, for example, $2, because you know people tend to think that this is much cheaper. So all of this literature says, like, I mean, there are good reasons to expect that these things are happening, and that they will happen in the markets, and that they will be detrimental for some people. And this is not, in some sense, this is not small money. So just to give you some examples again, there was this Card Act I think it was in 2011 or something like that in the US, that tried to regulate, I mean, a lot of the financial, the use of hidden costs in financial sector. And that has been estimated to save consumers for $11.9 billion it should be, a year. So it's a lot of money. There's a recent paper taking a little bit a different take by John List, my good friend and co-author, saying that Lyft could increase its profits by roughly $160 million per year by employing a left-digit bias pricing strategy. So this is something that I think matters, and therefore I would like to discuss it. So my take on this is I want to know people's views on these things. So we live in this kind of world. What do we think about it? And it's not like it's obvious to me that we should regulate it. I mean, there are like two ways of thinking about it. I mean, one is that this is like a voluntary transaction, and that's all good, in Econ 101. The other is to say that, well, I mean, there are certain things that are not okay in the market. And I think these people's views matter. I mean, it matters for the political economy of regulation. There are many stories how public outcry actually changed regulations, I mean, in this domain. But it can also potentially shape market behavior, right? It can shape where you want to work, where you want to buy stuff, and where you want to invest your money. And the basic question that I wanted to start out with was to see whether people find it morally acceptable that businesses sell products they know the consumer would have been better off not buying. So basically, this is the question you will hear more about. This question here. And we will discuss it a lot, and you may have many thoughts now what exactly is that question capturing, and I will come back to that. In some sense, and this is just our thought conceptual framework, so we think there are three types of people here when you think about people's views. One type of people we call, or we name, the libertarians. These are the people who say, like, okay, what matters for me is voluntary transaction. I mean, that's what the market is about. If no one is pushed into anything, that's okay. So that is what we call the libertarian kind of view. Then you have the other extreme view, the substantialists, who are saying, like, it's not okay to introduce, to sell a product that imposes a loss on the consumer. It's never okay. Now, that is just not an okay thing to do. And then you have these in between, what we call the proceduralists are saying, well, it depends. I mean, it depends on how active the company has been pushing this product and so on. And you will see that we try to come closer to like the shares of these types in our work. So what do? We basically, in this paper, we do two studies. So first we do a global study. So we thought like it would be interesting to see how I mean, is this something that, I mean, people think about broadly across the world? So we had the opportunity to do a survey experiment across 40 countries with almost 45,000 participants from the general population. Of course, these are surveys, they are selected, so they are representative on certain observables, but it gives us an idea, I think. And there we study whether people find it morally acceptable, whether people believe that the companies are doing this kind of stuff, and whether people would like to see stricter regulations in their country. And then we did a more focused study in the US with 3,600 participants as a follow-up. And there we wanted to connect more specifically to the bias literature. So we wanted to see, is there something particular about biases? So maybe you don't want companies to manipulate you, but these biases, I mean, that's just part of the game. If they can outsmart you, that should be part of what we accept. So we wanted to see whether people were more accepting of companies exploiting biases than pure manipulation. And we had this thing in mind that people would be more accepting of biases because they would think, well, actually, consumers, if they really focus and put in enough effort, they can avoid being taken advantage of in terms of these biases. And people should be held responsible for the consequences of their choices. So what do we find? So let me just tell that as well, and then we can go into the details. So we find that the majority, in the global study, that the majority of people do not find it morally acceptable that businesses exploit consumers. So they actually take a stand. But importantly, we also find that the substantial minority think it's okay. So we find this heterogeneity that I launched as a possibility, right? So it's not an obvious thing exactly how to think about it. Then we find that the large majority of people believe that that companies are doing this. Here we can't say whether they have different types of companies in mind. You will see how we did it. And thirdly, we find that the policy attitudes are strongly associated both with people's moral preferences, whether they think it's okay, and with their beliefs, whether they think companies are doing it. And we see overall that there's a lot of push for more stronger regulations. And in some sense, one of my main points in the paper is really to say that when we are thinking about this from the policy angle, we really need to understand both people's moral preferences, whether they think these activities are okay or not, and their beliefs about whether companies are doing it, right? So we need both the preference side and the belief side to explain policy. Then we go to the US, as I said, and there we find that indeed, as we pre-registered and thought in advance, that people think it's more okay to exploit behavioral biases, but still the majority object. So it's not like everyone now thinks this is okay. And the reason is exactly, one reason is exactly as we expected, that people believe that individuals can avoid this through own effort. And we also then show that these moral preferences are associated with both political and market behaviors. So that's basically what I will show you. Big picture. So let's go. Yeah, let me say 2 words about maybe where I see myself. So I think we speak to 4 literatures. First, to this behavioral IR literature, I think we come with a new perspective. So they've been studying this a lot from theory side, also doing empirical work on the level of exploitation. But we are coming here and saying, like, well, how do people think about this? And this can clearly potentially play into the political economy of this. And then maybe what I'm most excited about is really coming from the fairness literature. So we have almost solely focused on fairness in terms of redistribution. How can we achieve fair inequality in society? To what extent do people accept different types of inequalities, and to what extent should we redistribute? I really want us now, at least me and my team, to really think much more about what I call transactional fairness. Namely, what is a fair transaction in the market? There's been a lot of work about, like, fairness in markets, but more from like this perspective that, I mean, people become more selfish in markets and stuff like that. But I want to get a better understanding, how do people think about when a transaction is fair? And it's quite fascinating, because if you go to behavioral economics, the starting point in some sense for thinking about fairness in behavioral economics was a famous paper by Kahneman, Knecht, and Taylor, and they studied a case where this guy was selling umbrellas. And now, I mean, suddenly it starts raining, and he increases the price of the umbrellas, right? And is that fair? And this is exactly the kind of thing I would like to study, right? I mean, what is a fair transaction in this market? Today, I take this particular perspective by looking at the situation where someone benefits and someone loses. But you can also think about settings where both wins, but one maybe is taking the full surplus. Is that okay? And in some sense, in behavioral economics, this whole focus on transactional fairness got a bit lost. We can actually go back to Aristotle, and he will say exactly this. He will say there are two strands of fairness, two main fairness questions. One is the distributional one, the other is the transactional one. I should say there are papers who have looked at procedural fairness, so it's not like no one has thought about procedural fairness, but really focusing on this in a market context, I think we are making a contribution. And then I think there is a lot of new work now on like understanding people's preferences and beliefs across the globe, and we are coming with a new set of data here on how people think about consumer exploitation. And then I think this can also be of relevance for the political economy of market regulation. Okay, so that's the background. The plan now is that I will first talk about the global study. The study design, I mean, how we ask these questions. It's very simple, it's super simple. You will see how we have done it. Then I will go to the US study, talk about study design, the different questions, and a bit about policy and market behavior. Okay, so in the global study, this is an online study with 45,000 respondents. We did it through Norstat and Dynata. It's always super hard. I don't know, if you have not done global studies, this is extremely hard. How do you get this to carry across cultures, different socioeconomic backgrounds, etc., etc.? I mean, what is a good question? We did an enormous amount of pre-testing, and I will show you some robustness results also. Everything was translated very professionally. We did lots of reviews. We spent a lot of time, that's what I want to say, a lot of effort. Whether we nailed it, I don't know, but I'm quite confident that we did as good as we could. The survey is broadly representative along the classical dimensions, age, gender, political leaning, but we have oversampled the highly educated people, and we correct for that in the analysis. But of course, these are also selected into surveys, so on unobservables, we can't say anything. So these are the countries in the study. As you immediately see, we only have South Africa basically in Africa, so we can't say much about Africa. But otherwise, I think we have a nice spread, and that you can also see here. So we have here like GDP on the x-axis and regulatory quality, which of course is an important feature. I mean, to what extent? I mean, is there high quality regulations in the country? And you see that, I mean, we have a nice spread of countries. This population size is shown by the circle. Okay, so basically the setup is very simple. We asked this question that I started out with. To what extent do you agree or disagree with the following statement? It is morally acceptable that businesses sell products that consumers would be better off not buying. So this is the baseline question we ask. And then people can say strongly agree to strongly disagree. Of course, you may think, well, this is underspecified. And clearly it's underspecified because we wanted this to be not too complicated for people. So is it really capturing anything in a robust manner? And here we did a big between-subject data collection where we tested robustness across many dimensions. And I've shown them here. So first of all, okay, does it matter whether we talk about one specific business or talk about this as a general business practice? So we manipulated that randomly between people. Does it matter whether we mention the monetary loss of the consumer? Because what does it mean that the consumer would be better off not buying? So we make it more specific by saying that is a monetary loss in some treatments, in another treatments not, and this is also between design. We make it explicit whether the size of the loss is $100 or $1,000, and see whether that matters. So whenever we mention the loss, we vary whether it's 1,000 or 100. We vary whether we talk about a loss to the average consumer or to each consumer, which could also matter. We also vary whether we talk about there being an equal-sized gain to the business. So now I've focused on, the customer being worse off, but of course the business is better off. So maybe if this equals out, people are okay with it, right? So we tested whether that was important. And we tested whether we talked about moral acceptability, or not morally acceptable, I should say, versus morally wrong. So, is this sensitive to the exact language that you are using? And we randomized the order of answer options. And the beautiful thing is that, in some sense for my analysis, is that none of these had any effects. All of these were precise nulls. So all these manipulations, whatever way we did it, we got exactly the same pattern. So, I gave you a very small example. I think, you could have also easily think about much bigger numbers. It is a very important dimension. But I think it was quite comforting for us that, wearing in this way, did not have any impact on how people thought about it. So it seemed like people either had this idea in mind that, this is just not the right thing to do, or they had in mind that, okay, this is fine. It's a voluntary transaction. With the qualification that we did also some other treatment manipulations that were specific in the study. And that was going to this, what I said, the proceduralist thing. So maybe this depends on how active the company has been. So we had two manipulations of the question that we introduced in the between subject design. In one where we say explicitly that they manipulated information about their products to sell these products they know the customers would be better off not buying. So here, the customer is, the company is very active, right? They are manipulating information. In the other extreme, in our way of thinking about it, at least, the company was selling these products, but they provided all the relevant information about the product to the customer. So our idea was here, does that matter? Does it matter whether we have the baseline framing? So the baseline would just be this. It's morally acceptable that businesses sell products that consumers will be better off not buying. Or whether we have also add that they have manipulated information about the products to do this. Or whether we have this qualification that they have provided all the relevant information. And our idea was that manipulation would make it worse. And the fact that you have provided all relevant information would make it better. And maybe then it's okay. If you provide all relevant information, it's up to the consumer to get it, right? We use this to estimate these three types that I talked about: Libertarians, Proceduralists, and Substantialists. And then I asked about the beliefs about firms. So whether they think that the businesses often, so this is how we formulate, often manipulate information about the products to sell products they know their consumers will be better off not buying. So here we push the manipulate button in the global service, right? So is this something people think that companies are doing very often? And then we asked the policy attitude question whether the government should impose stricter consumer protection laws to prevent businesses from selling products they know the consumers will be better off buying. So here we relate it to the status quo, right? Do they want to have, do they want the government to push for stronger regulations? Okay, so what do we find? Well, I think this is quite striking. So this is showing you the share of people who answer each of the categories. And what you see here is that there is actually quite a bit of heterogeneity. So this is pooled across all the countries, right? So it's not like everyone is saying, wow, this is like just crazy stuff, right? This is not acceptable. Well, we find a majority not agreeing, but we find also a substantial minority of people thinking that this is okay. If we now still pool, then I will go into more country-specific numbers later. If we now look at, whether these manipulations that we did matter, so this was the baseline, we see that highlighting the manipulation, this is just the average response across all in the sample. We see that the manipulation makes it less acceptable, right? On average. So it is so people seem to care about like how active the business is, right? And it seems like the business can get some more acceptance out of reporting all the relevant information, right? So what were the differences here? Yes, there were differences, and some of them are maybe like along the lines that you expected. So in at least parts of Europe, you see that it's less accepted, so darker colors means more acceptance than in the US. But what stands out is that you see in Asia, we find very high levels of acceptance of these policies. And here you can see how this varies across countries. So here we have just made a binary variable. So it's those who say, the share of people who say that they somewhat or strongly agree that this is morally acceptable. And one thing that's striking here, of course, you should always be careful with cross-country analysis, is the enormous difference, right? So it goes from 20 or less than 20% in Austria, where I presented this last week, up to like 60% plus in India. I'm not saying we can straightforwardly compare these numbers. Maybe they have different things in mind and so on, but I still think it's a fascinating cross-country variation. And I think Germany, since we're in Germany, are also pretty low here in the level of acceptance. You see also, so here I show you the treatment effect, basically by comparing the level of acceptance when they provided all information to when they have manipulated information. And you see that basically in all countries, there is some concern about how active the company is, right? So the more, if they have done manipulation, you see that there's basically lower levels of acceptance in all the countries, except for Indonesia and Poland, and I don't know exactly how to explain that. Okay, so now we have just gone through this, and basically we now say, can we use this treatment variation to estimate the share of these three different types? And that's what we do. And what I just said, we define, and this is just a high-level definition of libertarians as people who accept even when businesses are manipulating. And then we say substantialists, they don't accept even if they've provided all relevant information. And then we say proceduralists are those who accept it when they've provided all relevant information, but not when the company has manipulated information. And now we can estimate at the country level the share of each of these three types. So that's what I show you here. So just to give you an example, in Finland, we find very low numbers of libertarians. We find very high numbers of substantialists. And then we find some proceduralists. So that's how you read this figure, right? When you see some white here, these are exactly the countries where the behavior was not in line with the kind of model we had in mind. So what this shows is that, there's a lot of variation in the share of libertarians across countries and in the share of substantialists. And I will come back to that when we look at the policy support. Okay, so that was the acceptability. Now comes the question like, okay, what do people think about the firm's behavior? So again, we ask the question in a very similar way. Businesses to what extent people agree with businesses often manipulate information about their products to sell products they know the consumers would be better off not buying. And again, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And here is what I showed you for the moral preferences. I mean, this is exactly the distribution you saw, where you saw quite a bit of heterogeneity. And now I want to show you the same figure for the beliefs. And what you see here, and this is pooled across all countries again, that you see that is very much support of people thinking that this is like the game that the businesses are doing, right? So most people tend to agree that businesses are manipulating information to sell products they think the consumers would be better off not buying. I think in some sense it was striking. I mean, I was expecting much more similar to this one, but this is what we find. Again, you see quite a bit of variation here in terms of the share of people agreeing. Now Germany has moved almost to the top, with a lot of agreement that this is what companies are doing. Of course, again, we don't know which companies they have in mind, and we don't know which sectors and so on. But I think it's a telling result. The next question is on the policy attitudes. Exactly the same line. I mean, whether the government should impose a stricter consumer protection laws to prevent businesses from selling products they know the consumers would be better off not buying. And as with the beliefs, we see very strong support for stronger or stricter consumer protection laws, which I also think is quite fascinating. We see high levels of agreement here in almost all countries. So if you just do this binary thing again, you see that in all countries there is more than 60% of people agreeing or strongly agreeing with this. Here I've shown you just 4 countries, just to give you a feeling: Germany, United States, Japan, and Brazil. And you see that in terms of support, you see that basically the differences are in terms of from neutral to strongly agree. So very few people seem to disagree that we should have stricter consumer regulations to protect customers. Okay, so that was the pure descriptives. Now I want to see how do these things fit together. So what we have done here is first within country analysis, where we basically say, so the support for these stricter protection laws, does that depend on your preferences, whether you think this is acceptable? And does it depend on whether you think that firms are actually doing it? And in some sense, I mean, intuitively, you would guess that it depends on both. And this is exactly what you see. So people who tend to think that this is morally acceptable are much less likely supporting the stricter protection laws. Right? And this effect is quite big because this goes from 1 to 5, so it's like 0.4 on this scale, which is quite a big number. And you see also that if you think that the firms are doing it, you are much more likely to think that we should have these regulations. Importantly, and maybe that's the most important thing, the third column here is really saying that you need to have both these things really take both these things into account when you want to explain or study policy attitudes. So they both matters, right? And I mean, the effect of one of them doesn't go away when you control for the other. So both people's preferences on this, how people think about this from the normative side, and their beliefs about how prevalent it is in the market is important for explaining people's attitudes to policy. We see also, as you probably would expect, that right-leaning people tend to be less supportive of these regulations. That's exactly what I guess we would expect. If we now do this between countries, so here we only have 40 observations, we see again that the beliefs matter a lot. So if you want to explain the cross-country variation in support for these regulations, you see that that's a lot driven by whether people in a country believe that, I mean, this is the businesses. Here, you don't see immediately that the preferences matter, but that's basically because the policy question is about whether you want to have stricter regulations than today. So then you need to control for what's going on today. And you see, if you control for regulatory quality, you see that, I mean, people, I mean, typically if you have high regulatory quality, you don't think it's as important to have stricter regulations. But now you see again that, I mean, your moral preferences matter. So the message here is really that the moral preferences and the beliefs matter both for within country variation in support and for across country various in support. And you see that I mean, we can control for regulatory quality, we can control for corruption, we can also control for GDP and government effectiveness, and these two objects that we have collected data on, namely people's moral views on this and people's beliefs, just remain very predictive. Of course, this is not a causal relationship, but it is these are associations, but I think they're still quite fascinating that we see such strong effects or estimated associations. I said that we could also classify, I mean, people into libertarians, substantialists, and proceduralists. And here you can also see that if we do it in that way, you can see that the more libertarians there are in the country, the less support there is for protection laws. The more substantialists, the same. We don't find strong evidence for the proceduralists, but we have much smaller numbers for that, so that's maybe not too surprising. The US study, let me take 2 or 3 minutes. What we do is here we want to go to the behavioral biases and have them more specifically into the picture, and then see whether people are more accepting of the behavioral biases and whether that relates to individual responsibility. Then we also want to see whether there is a broader set of mechanisms that can drive the policy attitudes and related also to actual behavior. And being very, very quick, let me just say we did a lot of work in terms of how to explain the behavioral biases. So just to give you one example, we told people who were asking about present bias, we told them research has documented that people often choose immediate rewards over large future benefits, even when they had originally planned to wait, a behavior known as present bias. And then we asked, is it okay that the companies are exploiting this present bias? And then we did the same, we did an attention bias, left-handed bias, default bias. We tested this and so on. So basically the structure in these treatments were, you are told the bias, and then you ask, like, is it okay to do this bias? We did 6 treatments here, so we had the same as in the main study. We had the manipulation information, and then we had these different biases. And what do we find? So first we replicate what we did in the global study. That, I mean, we see very little, low acceptance of manipulation, much more if they provide information. And then we find exactly as we pre-specified, we see that biases are much more accepting than manipulation, but less accepting than information. But you see, even for biases, people are not okay with businesses doing it. Then we go into this, I mean, showing that this to some extent is driven by people's idea that individuals can avoid it by exerting effort. We show that there's not a big difference in terms of how you think about the different biases. And then we basically, and now I'm just speeding up, show the same patterns as I show you in the global study for both policy attitudes and beliefs. And I just want to see here now, and I'll stop in 1 minute here, because there was a question. Here we add a lot of the other things we discussed. To what extent, I mean, your policy views on this depend on whether you think it's the low income that lose, whether consumers lose a lot, whether you yourself feel you have been exploited by this, and so on. And basically all of this goes in the same direction as you would expect, but it doesn't take out the importance of the moral preferences and the beliefs. And then I show that this also matters for consumer behavior or market behavior. And we also have some real tasks where we also find the same pattern, but since I'm out of time, I just want to conclude by saying that I think this topic of transactional fairness for me seems super important. We have made a first high-level cut. I mean, many more things to discuss, as you also indicated. But I think it's quite fascinating to see both the heterogeneity in people's moral views on this, but also that a very large minority think that, I mean, these things are not okay and want to have stricter regulations. So I'll stop here.